Good evening, everyone, I guess. We're very happy to have Mary Flanagan. This is how we say it, yes?
Yeah.
Here. Let's say that Mary is an artist, a writer, an educator, and a designer, right? She pioneered in the field of game research with her ideas on critical play. One of the first researchers who put a focus on the transformative potential of games. Mary is the founding director of the research laboratory and the design studio Tilt Factor Lab, which we hope we're going to hear a lot about it. And the CEO of the board game company, the wonderful board game company, Resonim. Her research and work move across different disciplines from painting to poetry to performance and of course game design. She is the Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor in Digital Humanities at Dartmouth College. In 2009, you published the acclaimed book Critical Play, which we all have to read in this program. It's a must.
We already read, yeah.
Yes,
but,
it was published.
It's part of the curriculum.
Yes, and I went to print. It's part of so many curriculums. It's like everywhere.
It is.
You know?
It is.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
And your fifth academic book, Values at Play in Digital Game, was written with the philosopher Ellen Nissenbaum. And it's extended the idea that thinking about values is a key to innovation, which is such a wonderful and thorough idea. You founded the game research laboratory Tilt Factor in 2003 to invent humanist games. We're going to ask you a lot about it. And to take on social through games. Your artworks and installations have been shown internationally, all venues all around the world, including the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Guggenheim, New York, Gigantic Airspace, Spain, Tokyo, wherever. Let me just say that this is Press Start, the Shankar Game Design Masterclass. It's a bi-weekly event where we host game professionals to talk about the theory and practice of games. I'm Barak Nerli, I'm the head of the department. With me is Renat Klosman. Asi Barak was supposed to be here too, but he's just actually visiting Israel. So that means that he can't actually participate in a Zoom class because he's too busy, with family obligation. But Asi is also a faculty member and Renat is the senior lecturer at the program. And I think maybe we're probably going to begin with your presentations and then move on to questions if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's great. Let me just get a little bit of my sharing set up because I am going to share a little bit of a screen. And I can talk about a lot of different things, right? So I'm very open to figuring out what's interesting to your. Oops, sorry, one sec. Very interested in talking what's interesting to your group, right? Because I can talk about so many different things related to game research, data collection, creative practices. It's kind of a nonstop thing. So I chose to focus a little bit on this particular part of the conversation, just documenting some things that have inspired me as an artist working in this area, but I can equally talk about the scientific and design aspects of this. It's just, we'll start here and we'll go wherever you want to go. I'm totally open to moving around. So, and I'm also interrupt driven. So if you have questions, you can always try to flag me down and stop me on the way. But I'm very interested in this idea of games as a social transformation and a site for transformation. And I think this has to do a lot with even the ways in which games have been studied, even in the 20th century. For example, many of you will be familiar with Johann Huizinga's ideas in Homo Ludens about this idea of a magic circle, the space removed from life, or some might counter argue that it's a space that is the key part of life. However we want to think about people entering this idea of a separate attitude, a separate kind of reality or a parallel reality that we voluntarily enter into, that play is kind of this sacred thing. And that, obviously when you're talking to people about video games and people don't like video games or whatever, somebody's like, oh, kids play too many video games. That's not really thinking about games as a sacred space. So it's kind of an interesting idea that if we think of games as transformative and possibly sacred spaces in some kind of way, then we become really kind of attuned to what we can do in them, right? So I like to show pictures of people playing games because it's kind of interesting when people are engaged in a game. We kind of know a magic circle when we see it, right? We can kind of see, oh, this is happening. You know, oh, a sport is happening. They're engaged in another kind of reality or another rule set. As soon as people have a kind of, you know, people are playing Pokemon Go or even AR games, you know, you can be like, oh yeah, you know, they're in another world. They're in this other transformative space. And so I'm always interested in bringing that transformation from the game itself into the real world and vice versa, bringing transformative things back into games and taking transformative moments in games and bringing them out. And so that kind of drives me to think about all kinds of games, and I'm really medium agnostic. I thought about this idea of critical play to seek out and then to make games that that challenge any kind of accepted norm, that reshape perception, that kind of are acting in a way that we could think about. Some people might use the word social justice. Some people might use the word games for impact. Change. I'm interested in that sense of transformation that can just make us somehow possibly, I mean, this is kind of strangely utopian, better people. How we define that is always an interesting question, right? Who's better for whom and why, right? So there are plenty of games that cross boundaries into, you know, between art and criticism, between diary, self-expression, and games have been, you know, this is just one example of a very interesting game, Magic Wand, but there's many games, and I'm sure you're seeing these because you're seeing a lot of games for impact by Molly Industria and by, you know, various other artists and activists who have been working in this space for a long time. And I too have been working in this space for a long time. And I tend to separate in my head games that are kind of coming out to meet a commercial mass audience in some way, and games that are either research-based, proof of concept, highly experimental, and maybe artworks. Like those tend to have these different audiences, and you can try to force one on another, but sometimes it doesn't work. So I actually think about, like, the stuff. I have a Kickstarter right now for this game called Retrograde, and it's a real-time roll and write game, and it's based on 80s arcade games. But you have, so I designed those games. They're still value-centric games, but they're really games that are designed to appeal to a mass audience. They might not have as much room to ask as many questions, right? That's an interesting trade-off. As designers, the more popular and mainstream your thing, then maybe you only get one or two places where you can twist the mold and have a kind of sense of transformation or pro-social material in it. For example, Surrealist Dinner Party is a card game I released, I think it was last year, and you have 30 real-life surrealist artists, and they go to dinner, and you have them kind of bantering, and you play and you feed them and stuff like this. So how I might insert social ideas into that game would be very different than how I would do it in an art game, but it still comes back to that sense of thinking about values. Where is the criticality? How is a game embed that criticality anywhere in there? And so there's tons of ways that we can talk about that. And since you've all read the book, I don't have to really go over like the sense of, you know, what does it mean to play critically? And there's a lot of various senses of that word in probably many languages, right? So, you know, we have things that are mission critical, like it has to happen. This is critical in order to make something successful. It's key. And then we have things about critical situations, dangerous situations, right? As well as being engaged in criticism. So I love this word because it brings a lot of perspectives on the urgency for playing critically, the kind of introspective nature of playing critically, and also this idea of just the kind of key importance of it all, to be able to think in this way. It's very easy to, well, it's not easy to design a game, right? You know that. Games are complex, and they're kind of, you have a lot of play testing and a lot of development. And then to add more expectations onto that process, that something has to have social responsibility, it has to be inclusive, it has to, all of these layers start to be very, very complicated. And it's a noble effort to try, and it's worthy of failure many times before you get it right. I can say that. I love talking about failure. Failure is awesome. Here's some images of tilt factor. So I have been working in a variety of projects over the years. We've done games that combat climate change. We've done games that combat perceptions about women in science, for example, that science is not necessarily seen as a place for women. So how do you change whole cultural perceptions, both of scientists and non-scientists? We've done things about healthcare systems and how to have policymakers rethink the healthcare systems in order to serve a variety of populations, not just the current system that we have in the United States, for example, which is based on insurance companies and this kind of stuff. So what would be alternate models? So games as brainstorming tools and embodied kind of ways of thinking through problems. We've done things about metadata. For example, how many archives are not necessarily very inclusive? Archives and libraries may not include a variety of people, a variety of historical events, a variety of data, or even if we have something digitized in the library, we might not know much about it. How could we get public participation through games and add to knowledge? So games as knowledge generators, right? So that you can use the games as mechanisms for so many things. It's a lot of fun. We've also done games where we have a VR game that's out on Steam right now, where you play as a scientist going between two different dimensions, and suddenly 3/4 of the way through it's like an escape room game. 3/4 of the way through, you look in the mirror and you happen to be a female character. And we had male science students playing this game and then documenting their expectations and their experience about finding out that they're a woman scientist. Lots of layers to this kind of stuff. And I've found so many valuable lessons, not only through data collection and like the social science, but also the experiential part, right? And those are different kinds of evidences and different kinds. I'm not sure what kind of game research you all do when you're trying to see if something's working or not. But it's an interesting question about what is success when you're trying to take on a difficult topic. What is it? How do you measure that? Yes, that this conversation happened, or this mindset was changed. These are all interesting questions for you. I wanted to show a few slides of some artworks. This is my project, The Giant Joystick, which is I wanted to take something familiar and enlarge it so much that it changed your relationship with it. So a joystick's very small, and one player is playing it, and in this case, groups of people have to play in order to work together. And it actually, you play traditional Atari games, but you play it with this object. And so you have these teams, and it changes the idea of what a high score is and how you have to work together. And by shifting the scale, you even confront your own embodiment. Like, wow, my hand moves faster than my whole body, trying to push the button, et cetera, et cetera. And as a side note, I thought this was kind of hilarious. This project is now in the Guinness Book of World Records. This year, they found it this year. It's an old project. They found it, and now it is a world record for the world's largest joystick. But I thought that was really funny. These people from England contacted me and said, "Oh, did you know that you have the world's largest joystick?" And I thought that was funny. So it's interesting when you see people playing, right? And when you come from an artist perspective, that games are kind of these social sculptures. They're about community design, they're about agency in the public sphere, and you're actually kind of creating a new system for people to interact with each other. And that to me is a very exciting thing. And I've done this also with like creating games for like urban planning and kind of urban development and neighborhood communications. We did this massive set of massive urban games. We did it in Shanghai and various New York locations for several years, where we would be doing, you had to go out and interview people, you had to get ingredients, but the clues for the ingredients were in other languages that very few people spoke. So you had to go find someone who could, you know, read the language and help you find your materials. So sometimes these, you can use games as a process for community intervention, you know, and getting to know people's historic relationship about their tradition, about their foods, etc. And then we would have a massive dinner party afterwards, where everyone cooks together and we have these kind of things. So in these cases, we have these ways in which we as game designers, right, since we're all designing, we kind of engineer subject positions. We engineer the ways in which someone could have an affective experience and a new relationship to things. And that to me is a very exciting thing and a very powerful thing that we have to take very seriously as game designers, because when people enter a game, they go all in, right? If you're not really playing, you're not really playing. So if you are really playing, you hope that the system you're playing in is you know, good in some way, however we define that. These urban games, I haven't talked a whole lot about them, but I've done a whole series of urban games. This one was called Play Your Place, and this one I did with urban developers in the UK and various locations in the United Kingdom with Ruth Catlow. We made a little collective called Local Play, and we were doing these games where we would have massive drawing workshops, like at parks, festivals, and shopping malls. And families would draw various things like, oh, this is a challenge to the community. This is what we hope the community might look for. You know, so we would workshop community ideals for that particular neighborhood. And then people would draw those ideals or those things. What are the challenges? What is it like to be here? And then we made a game engine, a 2D game engine that would take their stuff. I don't know if it's going to play. Let's see if it'll probably be choppy over the interwebs. Let's see. I don't see it playing. Oh yeah. So it would take their stuff and just kind of they could create their own game with it. So it's kind of way easier than Game Maker. This was really for people who did not know how to make a game at all. And they would end up with these really cool little projects in which they would have these 2D drawings of their own jumping around. They could set, you know, challenges, they could set destinations and goals. And just the very nature that someone could make a game, even if it's bizarre looking, was really important to the community, and also engaged different generations, which we found it really interesting, that parents were not afraid to draw, grandparents were not afraid to draw, people would just try this out, and that was a pretty cool thing. And then I've been doing this, so you notice these aren't necessarily digital projects. I do digital projects, but I also do non-digital projects depending on the kind of intervention I want to do. And for the last, like, I think it's kind of 20 years, I've been doing these little instructions where I give people instructions on the street and have them make a hopscotch, a street drawing where you hop around on it. I don't know if you have heard of that particular, the word changes throughout different languages. Morel is the French word. The word in German is really kind of complicated. It's Hufkoordinaten. Just
that sounds very different than morale.
Yes, hoops coordinates, and that's like, oh yeah, let's go. And basically, so I give people these cards, and then people will draw these hopscotches, and these have turned into gallery installations. Strangely, oops. This one is called Bombscotch, and it shows in a lot of game-related art shows around the world. It's one of the more popular map of the Mapscotch series, I call it. And each one of those circles are representative of the number of people killed by American military interventions around the world and in the United States. So Hiroshima, Dresden, Tokyo. And so it's a pretty serious piece, bomb scotch, and it has all the data on the wall, but people play it, and it's meant to kind of have a reflective, you're playing, but it's not very funny, and it's a kind of reflective experience, but people still go through the motions with their bodies, and it becomes kind of a thought-provoking kind of comment, that's the word, on military and on various kinds of ways in which the United States could be criticized in its own situation. Then I took these hopscotches and created this book. Actually, I created a whole book of them, and it's available in 3 languages, and I published this last year. In that weird little bubble in July when everyone thought, oh, COVID might be going away, and then it didn't go away. But there was this moment when everyone was outside in Berlin playing hopscotches for like 2 weeks, and the hopscotches are often kind of they start off kind of conceptual, like draw a line, stand on one side of the line, hop over the line, draw another line, and then invite someone to follow you. So they're kind of instructions for public engagement. And then I document where each one of those was written or performed in different places around the world. And then this is a favorite for some reason. It's interesting. City Scotch, draw rooms on top of rooms on top of rooms. And so sometimes people go all around the block drawing these rooms and making them tallest, fantastic city. It's interesting that this book is kind of an instruction to play. If people really voluntarily jump in, they really jump in and they take it seriously. And for adults to cross into the line of play in a public space is really hard. Actually, it's really hard to get a bunch of adults to say, "All right, I'm going to look like an idiot now." But once they go in, they'll totally do it. And it's often when you see, if you walk by on the street and you see some, hopscotch on the ground, there are people who will walk way around it, like, no, that's not me, I'm not playing. And then there are people who will engage with it, right? So it's this interesting way of how do you engage people where they're at? How do you provoke them to try to cross a line? So anyway, there's a lot of these, and they get more serious through time, like rent scotch, model rent increases in a typical street where you live, and then find housing. And so how do you draw that? How do you draw that? And that's part of the fun, actually, is their little visual puzzles. And so sometimes people just go off and start to draw, but they're reflecting upon this idea the whole time. And I think it's a kind of a special gift if you can actually take time. Someone will take time out of their day to reflect on an idea that you've provided them. It seems really magical, actually. It does feel like a magic circle. So I just am gonna, again, we kind of know when we're playing by what we see, and all of these works could be called games, they could be called artworks, they could be called performances. But as an art form, I think it's important for us to realize and kind of keep remembering that games are not bound by material, they're not bound by medium, they're not bound by context necessarily, and but they have their own gameness, right? They have a kind of, when you look at the history, when you look at human history and you see that early game pieces, even board game artifacts, there's some evidence, although it's disputed, but there's a site in Jordan where, for example, cup marked pieces have been pulled out of the ground from around 6000 BC. So maybe we have 8,000 years of board games, possibly more. I mean, many people didn't even need actual hard objects to play games. You have dirt, you have sports, you have the world, right? And we know animals play as well. So it's quite interesting to think about how games have been a part of human history from possibly the beginning, just with as music is, just as visual art and drawing is, just like kind of sculpture, making objects. We have play and games as these kind of really fundamental art forms. You know, it's not like, oh, games are a combination of graphics, sound, and code. Actually, they're really part of human history, you know, and I like to be the person who reminds us of that in the room and just say, you know, they're sets of cues, they're situations, and the experience of the game is the art form, right? So it's like, oh, game art, I want to be in game, I want to do game art, I want to, you know, this, but actually games are nothing unless they're activated. So it really is that experiential quality. And I guess I'll leave you with the idea while we open up for questions, and I can get to specifics about anything, any of these ideas and more. But we have very few words to describe how we feel when we play a game. You know, how some games, sometimes you're playing a game and you're like, oh, you get really competitive, you know. Other games, you're like, oh, my friends, you know, like the games produce moods, they produce feelings, they produce these subject positions. And we have very little study of that. We have very little language for it. We have very little, like, what kind of person have I become playing that game versus this game? That is interesting to me. The fact that we don't really articulate it. Then it's a personal experience, but it's really hard to describe. And so that's one of the criteria. And I didn't really write about this much. I tried to write about it in Critical Play and Values of Play, but it's something I would like to consider now. And I think maybe I'm trying to get to it in more poetic ways. This idea of what is the experience of a game, and what kind of feeling do we have in it, and how do we describe the aesthetic of the play experience, not the visuals and the audio, but the mood and the feeling that all of those things produce. All right, so that's my big picture. And in my little slideshow, you know, if you're really interested in, you know, charts and data about like studies on games and all of these kind of things, I got charts, I got data, I got all this stuff. But I wanted to start with the big picture stuff. So let's open it up for some questions or provocations.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I was just wondering maybe if we should open up to the students, or maybe Renata and I will ask you just a few questions just before. And
we have one
question.
Questions, but yeah.
Yeah, one question that I really want to ask you is that you're doing so many fantastic and interesting stuff with games. But usually it is, of course, with institutions or events or, you know, actually what I want to ask is, how can you reach all the audience to play games that promote social agenda? Because it seems like it's very easier with kids or with institutions, but it's really hard to tap all the audience.
Well, it is. It's hard unless you kind of position it in a commercial product, right? Like that's why I kind of tried to separate at the beginning of the talk. Like I have my players of my board games are all adults who voluntarily pay for the object. You know, they're in stores. They go to the store, and it's not about being an art convention, and it's not about being in a gallery. It's not an institution. So commercial products are not in the same category, and that is why they're interesting. And, you know, and they are hard to do, because it's just really hard to do a game that makes money, that does something positive, that you it does something positive, and you have invested in that. It's a lot of extra work to do that kind of game, and it's expensive work. So I think that's one of the tricks. And I think as more students find out about, oh yeah, I can put some social messages in my game. I mean, all games have messages in them, whether you design them intentionally or not. So to look at what you're making honestly and to kind of critique it from a value-centered perspective. I mean, you might say, oh, chess, oh, that's a war game and it doesn't really have values. It's just one side against the other. Chess is loaded with values, you know. Like it has a power hierarchy. There's royals, there's plebeians, right?
Sure.
The common people's lives are more expendable, right? There's two sides, so conflicts are only two-sided. They're never like surprises. So it kind of trains you to think about conflicts and
Binary.
hierarchies in a particular
Yes.
way. So if we can look at our games that we are making with that same kind of big picture, what am I really saying here? And take responsibility for it and maneuver it a little bit, I think that's how we can start to change the more mainstream games. And big game companies know it. They just don't, they're just not incentivized to do it. It's annoying.
You're right. Renat, you want to ask a question before?
Yeah, I was. Oh, perfect. Yeah, Nitan, go ahead.
I want to ask for you, what is the difference between art and games? Because there is like, I know, like I am an artist also, and there is many time a really big argue between what is the main aim of art and what is the main aim of games. So what is for you, when did you decided to do a game and when did you decided to do it as an art piece?
That is a good question. That is a good question. I think it's partly who I'm working with. So if I'm doing, like, this is a completely single person thing. I just make these things. And when I make things on my own, they tend to just be so weird that they're pretty much art pieces because, and they're games, but they're art-ish games because I'm not really thinking about audience. I'm not play testing them 100 times. I'm making something I find interesting, right? And yes, I play test them in the sense that I go out with people and engage with them. And I might change a few things, but I'm not like, okay, we got to get this review. We got to have good reviews, so we got to have this gameplay dynamic, and it's a different way. It's a different process for me. So yeah, I don't. Sometimes I start off and I think I'm making one thing and I make another thing. That happens all the time. But and sometimes I'm making something that's kind of, whoa, that's way out there, and it's like, actually, this could be made more palatable for everyone, and it could be even popular. And like Surrealist Dinner Party was on the edge. Surrealist Dinner Party is like, how many people really want to think about surrealists, you know? Like, I do. But and actually the rest of my team at Resonant, they're like, not everyone was super enthusiastic about the idea. Some people thought that it was, you know, too arty, and then that's pretentious. So that was around there, and that was interesting. I was like, well, it's cool though. so yeah, there's no line. I wouldn't say I have an arguable line. I think it's how the process starts for me, and whether I'm doodling in my sketchbook and I come up with these kind of things, or if I'm like brainstorming with my game design team, and you know, if it gets too weird, I think they shoot it down. So they're a good check on how weird is too weird. On the other hand, you never know what actually can be palatable or not, but it's an ongoing challenge. It's an ongoing challenge.
Great. Anyone else? Let me see if there are some questions on the chat.
Oh, yeah.
In the meantime, I will drop my own question, which is related. You mentioned the big blockbuster games, of course, the commercially successful games, but on the other hand, you said that the critical play games or games based on research or something more, work in advance to have some social message are less commercially successful. Do you think that there is a growing niche market for these ones? Or as a designer, can you actually make a living or create games which are not intended to be, globally played?
Yeah, there are niche games, but as far as the social impact arena, I think it's very difficult to think that that's a full-time job with a full-time thing. I think it's really challenging. I think that, and please prove me wrong, because that would be awesome. I would love to live in a world where that was the case. I mean, certainly people are making bits and pieces of money here and there selling, indie games, but the market is really saturated, and it is, when it's not like when early web games happened and there weren't that many, and so everybody kind of heard about the same thing. It's much harder to gain traction right now, especially because of the role of social media influencers and product development, and there's a lot. It may surprise people, like, I have a little board game company, women-led board game company. Some reviewers are interested in reviewing my game, and other reviewers, many reviewers want to be paid to review. So there's this whole economy of reviewers and social influencers, and to get on that particular person's review show, you have to pay thousands of dollars, so it's like, oh, we can't participate in that. So I think a lot of it ends up being about capital and investment, and so there's a lot. It's hard to set up shop and be an indie game designer without a day job, but it's possible. It's possible. I have a day job.
It's different from a game design, no? Oh, you're a college
I'm a professor.
You're a professor, obviously. Yeah.
Being a professor is my day job. I like teaching, but I also, I go kind of above and beyond. Like most people aren't like, doing that many things as when they're professors. They're normally like, they just write the book or whatever. So I'm a little bananas about that. I have a question in the chat.
Yes.
Okay. Ben Cohen says, how would you go about measuring the social impact of a game? What are the metrics? Can we apply these methods to popular video games to check their social impact or influence? Answering the second question, yes. You can take any popular game and analyze them along lots of different metrics. So that's, you can study them. Why people don't study them? It is expensive. And they would probably find problems. And so if I'm Blizzard or Activision, what's in it for me for you to study my game and say that it's bad? That would be a bad waste of my time and my money, right? And I'm using bad and good in these kind of simplistic ways. But what if? So, for example, we did a study on Cards Against Humanity. If anyone knows that game, a card game where you're doing atrocious, you say and think about atrocious things, like abusing animals. There's racist stuff in there. There's just all kinds of difficult things, and it's supposed to be funny. And I was kind of convinced. I was like, gosh, that they even say a party game, made for horrible people or something. So it's like, wow. But everybody, no one knows what to do with this game because it's like it's so over the top, and you play it, but you play it guiltily, and then it's like, oh, am I? And then no, it's fine. It's just a game, and is that really okay? So we studied that actually, and we studied the game in a research study in which we were looking at whether we thought that it kind of reinforced negative thoughts about other people and reinforced stereotypes. And we ended up finding that game in particular in our research study made people reported feeling very guilty after playing it. And people reported wanting to be better people. So it was almost like they were like, oh, I should never be that horrible. And then they went the other way. So that was interesting. I thought, oh God, this is really going to be bad. So sometimes your hypotheses are not necessarily correct. And that might not be true across the board. It might not be true in all. It wasn't a huge study. It was like 250 people or something like that. How you study this stuff, what I have done is I have worked with people who are trained in social psychology and psychology, because they have a lot of standardized measures about how to, for example, measure empathy, which is notoriously difficult. We say, oh, it's a VR game, it'll be empathetic, we'll put you in the shoes of somebody else. Well, I tell you what, that isn't a given that just because you put someone in the shoes of someone else, they will feel empathy. And there was a really great study on a game called Spent, which was intended to make people, it was just text, but you're put in the shoes of someone who has lost their job and maybe end up homeless. And they have to make you as the player have to make difficult decisions about the kind of money you spend. Do you spend money on your sick child? Do you spend money to fix your car? It's really challenging, right? So you're trying your best, and you may or may not make it through the month. You may be evicted or not be evicted from your home. The game was made by a Christian charity to promote empathy and sympathy for homeless people. They're like, if everyone knew how hard it was, they would feel more generous and they would want to help people. And a researcher in psychology, social psychology at Yale, a graduate student, actually did several studies on this game and found that a pro-social game, maybe some of you have played it, I don't know, it's a cool little game, but found that while it increased people's sensitivity towards homeless people, it also gave players the impression that poverty was personally controllable, that it was a choice, because games have choices, and people reported that it was more of someone's choice to be homeless. So there's some kind of sense of that they were making choices that led to their homelessness, instead of being a situational, systemic problem about wealth and other things. So that is a really interesting thing, because that kind of feedback was not what the game makers intended. So games can do unintended things, and that's what's really interesting to try to examine. For Ben, who is interested in these measures, and then we'll get to Nitzan. The measures, there are lots of different kinds of measures. If you look up various kinds of social psychology, what I would encourage you to do is go to tiltfactor.org's research page, where we publish all of our research papers. And in our research papers, like on the bottom of, the research papers should say what measures we used. So for example, there's personality measures, like the big 5 personality measures, and you can get those kinds of things and adapt them. There are many, what I learned from years of working with social psychologists is that, and I was able to work with them because I got grants, and I was able to hire social psychologists to work in my lab. That's how I ended up working with them. I could have also collaborated with them across departments, but often, at least in United States institutions, it's easier when there's a grant involved. So I worked with grants, and I hired postdocs in social psychology who were interested in these questions about games. There are all these kind of interesting fascinations. One of my last postdocs was interested in this idea of rejection, like how we perceive rejection and failure. Who tells us we're failing and how we're told we're failing has different kind of impacts on our minds, if we're like an introvert or extrovert or these kinds of, so there's lots of ways in which this stuff is studied. So I would go into papers that are doing this kind of scientific research and look for which measures they're using. There's plenty of measures, for example, about bias, gender bias, discrimination, racial bias. There's ways that we can measure that stuff. And again, it's one lens. There are other things, like I talked about, that aesthetic of play may not be that particular measurable thing, but it's one of the ways in which we can scientifically measure. Okay, I hope that helps. I don't know if I'm saying your name right. Nitzan?
Nitzan, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. So first of all, thank you very much. It's been a very eye-opening and heart-opening lecture, and I appreciate it a lot. About the things that you said, there's something that you said you regarded games as thinking tools or facilitation tools, and you also mentioned that you just started off with thinking about value is a key for innovation. And I was wondering if you actually had the opportunity to take part in a process within businesses, actually usually using games, either to develop games with them, to encourage some kind of a shift in the like the business, or to actually push forward some processes, let's say like vision building or value mining or stuff like that.
Yeah, no, it's true. I personally tend to be somebody who just wants, I'm kind of a serial inventor. So I just keep making stuff. I've thought so many times about, oh, this is I could make a whole series of human resources games and go into every institution and help them transform, blah, blah, blah. My skill set, I get bored with this kind of thing. So my skill set is really coming up with the initial idea, but other people have done it. So other people, for example, I have a game called Buffalo, which is kind of a brainstorming game tool. And someone wrote a book about how to use it in facilitation. And then they go out and they use it for facilitating conversations in HR and things like that. So yes, all of these seeds are useful in transformation. And that's one of the reasons and boy, you know, I am in a country right now where we have very big divides across recently, like kind of rawly exposed, not saying they weren't there, but they're like raw. And I keep, you know, wishing that I'm not the person probably to organize a mass, you know, social movement around some of these ideas that I've kind of discovered. It's like the person who discovered the mouse is not the person who commercialized the mouse. Like I'm the person who discovers stuff and like, oh wow, and then I'm like, oh, I want to do more of that, and I'm not really the person who makes these gigantic social movements. But I would love for someone to do that, because we have serious global crises about people needing to communicate across very divided points of view, and we have some science to help us actually, and some exemplars. There are ways to kind of cross these kinds of things. For example, one of the biggest things that is happening in kind of in particular situations is this idea of psychological reactance, and that's an idea where if something is very close to home or something is going to challenge your sense of identity, you will react to it. You know, like there are ways to get around it. For example, fiction, like sci-fi and very fantastic stories, can actually suspend people's sense of psychological reactance because they're not personally threatened at this moment. You know, so metaphors and, you know, other ways of kind of storytelling might be really useful right at this point to stop people having like psychological reactance on this side and that side. And I think COVID exacerbated a lot of people's tension and anxiety and made people even more like reactant physically as well as emotionally. So I think we have to really understand that phenomenon as designers to be able to have, if we're really trying to do any kind of transformation. That's just one example.
Asaf has a question. Thank you, Asaf.
Hi, thank you. So thank you, Mary. It was brilliant and very thoughtful and provocative. And I have, well, first of all, I just wanted to say I was thinking about this definition between art and design, and you're mentioning the gaming as thinking tool, and I was like thinking of Cézanne's Paul Cézanne, who was an artist, and he said that the function of art is to lift the thought. So you can use that, and this, you know, it ties both of the things.
That's nice. I'm writing it down.
But actually, what I wanted to ask is, you know, part of the things that we try to think of is to be able to see that the technology is not neutral, and it has a function. And I'm wondering, how do you approach, like physically, to the game? There are so many theories. I'm just, you know, thinking of the global south again, the global north. And you are sitting in the global south, of course. I'm sorry, you are sitting in the global north, of course. And you put your own values inside those games, and then you release it to the world. So, I mean, how do you, I mean, you can't stay neutral, I guess, but
no.
How do you put this on the platform while designing?
Yes, this is really a great question. And it's why I've not taken on several projects that I thought were doing this particular kind of problem in an extreme. I would say, first of all, like my board games and stuff right now, they're in English. So that's already, you know, a limitation. This next one I'm doing in English and Spanish, at least in the American audience. I don't have a kind of global, like it's a smaller company, I'm not like, it's not like I'm like going all over the world in the global south selling board games, but I would say that it's super important. So for example, I've been approached by many nonprofits at my lab, for example, to make, a game for young girls in Mozambique to get the HPV vaccine, and make a game on the cell phone in order to kind of like many people are like, oh, let's use a game to do blah, blah, blah. And let's, and some of these presumptions about what's going to be effective, where, who has access and literacy and interest and time, and all of these questions are super problematic. And there are many nonprofit organizations or donors who come up with, oh, well, that's the solution. Hey, just make an app and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but that's not the solution for that group. The solution for that group has to be made with that group and from that group. And there are some interesting design process. Have you heard of Ghana Think Tank? They're a group, and again, it's started by an American, so there's that global North, privileged Western, blah blah blah. But and white guy, but we can criticize all we want. But at least he's trying to do something different, where he had designers from the global South come to the United States to help design fixes to our problems. Like, okay, you would fix this totally differently. Like, how would you fix this? And then there could be an exchange and a community develop, but realizing that all communities have something to offer, even in both directions, right? That it's a conversation, and that being open to thinking that we don't have the answer over here, and you may have a better answer coming from a particular mindset, place, culture, and use of materials and everything else, So I think that the kind of getting out of the designer as the person who solves problems and into the idea that the designer is a person who makes the condition, you make the conditions around solving problems, or you try to figure out a situation in which problems could be solved. Like, I hate to use these kind of passive words, but it gets us out of thinking like, oh, the designer comes in and tells us what to do. We have to really kind of alter that, I think, as a power differential, and say, okay, designers have to maybe think about their role differently, and not just token inclusion, right? It has to be a kind of fundamental process shift. And I would love to see the next kind of generations, take ideas from critical play and values at play, and just like, somebody just sent me a thing about someone who used those ideas and made a whole challenge, like to reimagine disability design from a disability point of view first, from an ability, so that community gets to take the design reins and then reflect on those values rather than. So there's action happening. So I think it's great. It means that it's a never stuck field, right? It can't ever be stuck. It has to be a fluid field. And what you're learning now about process isn't going to be what you're using in 10 years for process. And that's, oh, hurrah, because it means you won't get bored.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. So we have enough time for maybe one or more questions. I just want to ask you before anyone else asks. I mean, you move through so many disciplines. You write, you paint, you design games. Is there anything specific is there any art form specific that you feel more comfortable with?
It's funny that you say that, because I'm working with AIs right now, and I'm working with AIs, and it's not really game related, but I'm working with an AI that I trained only on the work of women's art, global women's art. So I made a massive database of 25,000 images made by women, and wow. It's like crunching these images and then creates new images. And so what I'm doing now is like painting AI generated art. And this is really interesting, because I'm so used to my whole career has been, I did a little bit of painting and stuff, but mostly I've been a media artist, mediated. I'm very comfortable being mediated and like run this process to go through this process and have this process. And so, and even games are a kind of mediation. There's a set of rules buffering you and I. It's not like I walk up to you and like you know, like there's a set of rules, so that we're like functioning within the set of rules that makes me comfortable. So it's my non-comfort level is when I'm not having a kind of systemic, like, so I'm like, oh, I got to paint this thing. I'm painting this thing. It's not mediated. Can I just project on it first before I paint it? Like, you know, so that's been an interesting year. That's like a COVID development. And yeah, I mean, often, and it's so funny. I had a recent show. I'm planning this show, and I'm taking some of the AI images as prints, and I'm putting them on a wall. And I was like, oh my God, this is so easy. You just print it and you put it on a wall. Like, who thought of that? I'm so used to like, oh, there's 4 iPads hooked up to this network, and then there's this like horrible broken thing, and like the code stops working, and there's a pole in the room, and people hit it with, you know, when they're playing this. I'm so used to much more complicated things. So it's great to have some kind of simplistic. It's like, wow, that's so simple, awesome.
It's so interesting that you said that it's great. Okay. Some people are kind of afraid of all this simplicity, but it's great.
I'm super afraid of simplicity, actually. So that's my next life goal.
Yeah.
Nissan,
so
another
in the same,
Nissan.
in the same direction.
It's actually the first Nissan, which
Yes.
It depends how you count. So I will continue the question. How did you decide the medium that you want? Like, you have an idea, you have a need that you will discover, you have something, you have a mechanic. How did you decide what medium you want that you will get in the end? Like, what is your process, if you can share?
Well, that is a good question. You know, I didn't start making board games until 2010. And part of it was because I moved to New Hampshire, and I've always taught paper prototyping and that kind of stuff, but then we make a digital game. And I was first a digital designer. Since the 1990s, I've been a digital designer, right? So I, professionally, and I couldn't find anyone who could program. Like, basically, I'm in the middle of the woods with a bunch of undergraduate students who were just like, well, that's cool. And every time we would try to get them to program, they couldn't really do the level that you need to do in a game. And so I would be like, all right, well, let's do what we can do. What if we made it out of cards? And then so I ended up kind of by accident. I mean, I played board games as a kid, but I normally would take the paper stuff as a designer and move it into digital and use it as a kind of process tool. And so the process tool started becoming the medium. And now I just go between whatever I, you know, have time and energy for and access for, and also what the audience is. It's a complicated web. You know, certainly a lot of the students want to do, you know, VR stuff. But in fact, it takes so long to get a student up to the point where they can make something interesting in a VR thing, and they can make such an interesting thing with a couple pieces of paper or a sport or something else. So for me, part of it is that I'm also teaching undergraduates, and so I end up being a little bit more analog because of just the expertise level that it's much, the concepts get in there, and wherever you take it, you can bring it into digital, you can bring it into, but it's really these fundamental concepts that you can't. It's hard to learn later, I think. It's hard to learn, oh yeah, somehow values are entering my games that I've made 20 of them already, and now you're asking me to challenge, and I don't even know how to uncode that. And, you know, it's like starting with the kind of foundational system is really important to me. So yeah, it's a good question. I move back and forth. I've been playing around with these AI generated clouds, and I don't know if they want to be paper or if they want to be a little digital app thing. I don't know. I'm playing around with it. So yeah, it's a combination of how it feels, who I'm working with, and what the audience is. I think it's
great.
And I wish I had a more of a strict plan for you. I could say, you know, when you have this idea, put it over in that box.
We like to be confused and inspired from new ideas, and this is part of the humanist approach to video games, I guess, to be a little confused, right?
Yes. Do I do my own programming? So I used to, and I'm not great. I'll be honest, like I'm like all over. So I'm like the ideas person. I'm not the strongest programmer. I can do it, it takes so long. And with my schedule, I'm just like, okay, get this person to program this thing. Because I'll design what it's supposed to, you know, okay, this should be a different class and this should be a different class and you should move these things and this object has to be able to move. I can do that, but I don't spend my time programming. But early on, when I was doing early web art and all of that, I did. So it just depends on how much time you have, frankly, and if you can. I know some people are real purists and they have to do all their graphics, all their programming, and it's their one person shop. And then there are other models, you know, there's a ton of different models. As well in the art world, you know, sometimes there's artists who have the lone artist in the studio. And then there are other artists who have, you know, Olafur Eliasson has a factory, you know, so there's tons of different models out there. So you just find one that works for you. Sometimes people work in pairs and like one person's better at the graphics, one person's better at the storytelling or something. Yeah. Should we become aware of moral agendas and values in our games? Yes. Aren't we obliged to inform our audience about moral values embedded in them? Should we? Interesting question. So, you know, game players are pretty good about picking up what you're trying to tell them if you go over the top, right? If I say, oh, you should recycle, shouldn't you? You know, like, or something like this, you're going to be like, oh God, I hate this game, because it's not trusting that that the player has autonomy and agency and the right to decide, right? So if you ever impinge on that, your social activism won't work. But it is an interesting question about how much you tell people. So I have this game, Buffalo. It's a card game, and it's just got words on it. And we've discovered some interesting things, that it lowers people's measures of prejudice and it raises people's social identity complexity level, which means that you accept a wider range of kinds of people in your life, and you might not have as many stereotypes. So it breaks down stereotypes. So that game is really cool, and it's pro-social. And when it came out, you know, people had articles about it. It was in like, you know, give this to your racist relatives, you know, stuff like this, you know. But will people buy a game if I put on the box, makes you less racist? I mean, maybe at this particular moment in the United States, maybe people would actually. But when it came out, it was not something that will. You know, this is not, people don't want to admit that they're racist, and therefore they want to go and seek out a solution, right? Most people think that they have under control what they are, right? They're like, I'm fine. I've worked with, you know. So it's an interesting question about what, you know, certainly what kind of values come out of a particular game. Like some people might say, oh, you know, Call of Duty, man, it's about loyalty and friendship. Those are my values, you know, because you could interpret Call of Duty like that, right? You could say, oh yeah, you know, it's about, or you could say it's not about that, and it's about distrust and about, you know, revenge, and it's about all these whatever. So we have to be very careful when we try to understand this stuff, and just and have conversations, you know, have conversations with each other. You're a community of practice, and it'd be great for you all to be debating this stuff about where are the values, and in this game, let's debate the values that are in this game and see what comes out. Whether you inform the players, I mean, again, it's an interesting question. If you say, by the way, my game will make you racist. like if you know that, why are you making it? You know, like, so
usually because of the money, you know.
Well, this is like
yes,
this is like Rockstar games, right? It's like, our game is so horrible, you know, like you get to rape
People don't
prostitutes.
care.
Awesome.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
they pretty much tell you.
Yes.
You know, so yeah, I guess you could have that experience. So yeah, this is all great. But what I would urge you all to do, since you're all very engaged in these ideas, is just keep debating and have a game of the week. And when you debate the values, you know, like it would be very eye-opening to start to pick apart things that are very familiar. Go to stuff you love, right? Like go to like Legend of Zelda, or like some kind of classic thing in your heart, and then just go, oh gosh, what are the, you know, you'll never be the same again. Doesn't mean you can't love them. I mean, you can love something that's really problematic.
So one more question before, because we really need to finish. Tzachi.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, thanks
Hi.
for this. I just want to ask, when did you understand that you want to make games? And what was the first game that you consider that is your real first game that you did, that you created?
Oh, interesting. I made a lot of media artworks on the web in the early .com craziness. And then I moved to Texas, and I could have either done interactive design or games. And I ended up doing games but I almost took a job in an ad agency doing interactive design. So I was like this close, and I ended up doing games. I was doing educational games. So the first game I ever worked on, a commercial game, was Nile Passage to Egypt, which was 1993 or 4 or something like that. Yeah. And even then, I put a woman of color on the cover of the box, I would just say. And for my second game, I'm just saying, so you can make choices conscientiously, even in the past. Yeah. So yeah, and then but I didn't decide I want to be a game designer. I'm other things too, I'm not really in a box. I could easily go to the next talk and give a talk to a bunch of psychologists about the psychological studies, and then I could go over here and talk about AI. So you don't have to just be a game designer. So yeah, if I had to choose just be a game designer, I probably wouldn't have done it, because the one thing I like about being a designer in general is that you're not stuck in a box, and you're a student for the rest of your life, because you are always learning what the thing is that you're trying to understand as a designer, and what the system is and what the context is. So it is like, it's like being a researcher of everything.
So if you
I hope that's not intimidating.
Because you mentioned your first game, I was just thinking, you came from a humanities background, and you were a woman, you are a woman. So was it easy to be, part of game designers back then? It's not easy right now too, because most of them are engineers and men.
Yeah, no, it was not easy. I'll just say, no, it's a little bit better now, I'll say. But it was bizarre.
Was it hostile or?
Oh, just people just thought I was an idiot constantly, and I would have to prove myself 5 times more than anybody else, and all that jazz. Everybody who's gone through that knows that stuff. Or like, I would give a presentation, and they'd be like, my CEO would pat me on the head and like say, "You did a good job." I'm like, whatever, So like, yeah. And then the guys all got gifts. Yeah. At the startup companies, the guys all got gifts. One guy got a motorcycle, and the other guy got, like the CEO would just buy the guys gifts and like whatever. And then I'd go and play Network Doom and like try to shoot them all. And, I had to fit in. Yeah. But I think it's way better now. It's more open, and people are accepting of a lot of different kinds of people. But there's still, people will challenge you. But that's true even in non-technological ways. I think it's really interesting, and I have to go because I have to run a faculty meeting in 5-10 minutes. But my last question, I thought it was technology, right? Oh, technology, coding, it's so gendered, so I started a board game company because I have this game called Monarch, and you play as 4 sisters, up to 4 sisters, and you're vying for the crown. It's a non-violent game. Probably you can figure that out. And you can play by these different strategies like culture and wisdom and bounty, which is like an eco strategy. And I pitched this game. It was a pretty cool idea, and it was all wrapped up. And I pitched the game to this publisher, really quite well-known publisher worldwide. And they're like, if you publish this game under a German man's name, it would probably be a better idea. And I was like, really? Well, it's not like I love my name. So I was like, well, okay, that seems weird, but and then he's like, and can you get rid of the women thing? He's like, why sisters? Why are you doing this? Why can't you just make it about a normal family?
Maybe can you give them games?
Right. And so I started my own company because I was like angry. I was like, all right, I know this is a good game. So like, you will not stop me. You will not stop me. And so it's paper. So this does go to show you that it's not about technology. It's kind of like who has the right to play. It's like the last bastion of white male power. No offense to, anyone in the room, but like, it's the last bastion of like, this is my playroom and you will not take my toys, And I was like, it's okay. We all can have toys,
Yeah.
You might like this game.
The right to have fun. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. The right to have fun, the right to play. It's and this goes back to the global north and global south, who has the right to even play? Who has the time? And, is play a privilege, and who gets to have it? Like, this is a good question to end the session on.
Yeah, Mary,
thank you all. This was
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Great question.
Because we can talk for hours. That was so inspiring and so many things
well, if you
to
ever
think
need me
about.
back, I'll come back.
Oh yeah, hopefully. Well, we will invite you to Tel Aviv. We will invite you to Tel Aviv. COVID is over and you can come over. Yes.
Oh, I've always wanted to go. Okay.
There you go.
That's
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.